Welcome everyone to the fourth Carbon webinar. My name is Nigel Marks, and on behalf of the Australian Carbon Society and Curtin University, we're delighted to be online again with our carbon colleagues around the world. So for those of you who are in the Americas, good morning. If you're in Europe or elsewhere, good afternoon. And for those of you here in Australia and throughout Asia, good evening. Now, before I begin, I'd just like to remind you that this session is recorded and it will be available on YouTube afterwards. And as always, a link will be provided on the Carbon webinar website, pointing you to the correct place on YouTube. Now, after the presentation, there will be an opportunity for a Q&A. We won't do it by talking, we'll do it using the chat box in Zoom. So for those, most of us are pretty familiar with Zoom now, but if you're not, you'll see the chat icon there to the left of the share screen button. So just type any questions that you have for our speaker into that box, and they'll be read out at the end of the presentation. That's a really good way to communicate. So don't wait till the end to type your question. You can just do it as it occurs to you as we go through. You'll also notice on the slide there's a mention of a link to something called GatherTown. This will be an informal catch-up that we'll do once the formalities of this presentation are concluded. And this is an online tool that we can use to walk around with a little avatar and have a bit of a personal chat, a little bit like what we might have done at a traditional conference. Okay, so that's all the formalities out of the way. So if we just advance the slide there. So I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Miguel Caro from Aalto University in Finland. So Miguel has a physics degree from Tenerife in Spain. He moved to Cork in Ireland for his PhD. And since 2013, he has been at Aalto in Finland, where he's been performing computer simulations of very high quality and at the cutting edge. And since 2020, he has been an Academy of Finland Research Fellow. And I'm delighted to introduce Miguel because he's using the very best methods to simulate carbon. And he also has been performing simulations that are very close to my research heart, including my PhD. So with that all out of the way, Miguel, can you please share your screen and commence your presentation on simulating carbon materials with machine learning interatomic potentials?
Yes, thank you very much, Nigel. First, for giving me the opportunity to self-promote a bit more, and also for the nice introduction. So I'm going to share my screen now and go to presentation mode. So as Nigel has said, I've been working on simulating carbon materials using different methods, from quantum mechanical based density functional theory to empirical potentials. And then more recently, we took quite a bit of interest in machine learning potentials which live a bit in between DFT and empirical potentials, and kind of give you a touch of each. So I'm going to show you an overview of what I've been working on in the past probably 4 years or so, and then I'll be happy to chat with you and answer any questions that you may have. So this is a bit of an overview of my presentation. First, I'm going to give a quick overview of the methodology that we're using, introduce machine learning potentials and descriptors, which are very important for these methods. And then I'm going to talk about simulation of the growth mechanism in tetrahedral amorphous carbon, which was the first application of the methodology that I was involved with. And I'm going to move on to talking about how we added van der Waals corrections to these potentials, which is a more recent development. And if I have time, I'm going to talk a bit about X-ray spectroscopy for carbon-based materials. So how we can use machine learning models. In this case, it will not be interatomic potentials, but they're very related methodologically to machine learning potentials, and we can predict XPS spectra with them. Yeah, so the motivation why we want to use machine learning potentials is that there is a trade-off that we cannot get rid of between how much it costs you computationally to simulate a bunch of atoms in a box and the accuracy that you can obtain with a given method. So on this corner of the graph, we have Consham density functional theory, which is a quantum mechanical based method. It gives you quite good accuracy for many purposes, and especially it gives you very good flexibility in the sense that you don't really need to worry so much about the composition of your system or something like that. So it's very much a black box method. It's also quite expensive computationally. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have classical interatomic potentials, which rely on this kind of simple analytical functional forms. And the problem with these is that they lack accuracy for many purposes, especially for bond breaking and bond formation, but they're very cheap. Right, so what we would like to do is to get the best of both worlds. And in practice, machine learning potentials allow us to not get the best of both worlds, but get close to that sweet spot where we would do things accurately and cheap. So the main issues with classical potentials are the lack of transferability. So you feed your potential for one problem and you cannot reliably use it for another problem. So imagine that you're doing phonons in graphene. You cannot use that potential for looking at amorphous carbon. It just doesn't work. They're non-reactive, so they cannot handle bond breaking and formation. I can see a typo on bonk. I don't know what that is. And this is a kind of example that I'm going to give about about this limitation of classical potential. So imagine that you have these two molecules interacting. So on the left-hand side, you have a water molecule, and the other on the right-hand side, you have a hydroxyl ion. And you want to look at how these two molecules exchange a proton, right? So if you do a DFT calculation, this is the potential energy surface. And of course, it's symmetric because it's a perfectly symmetric problem. But if you rely on a harmonic potential, the harmonic potential doesn't know that that proton can ever become unbonded to the original molecule. And you can see that the both approximations completely diverge. So to solve this problem, we rely on these so-called non-parametric fits, which are machine learning potentials, and there are several ingredients to these approaches. First, you need to construct a reference database of atomic structures. So, so you arrange atoms in particular ways, depending on the problem that you want to look at, and you calculate energies and forces with DFT. Usually, you can also rely on, for example, methods beyond DFT. And then that characterizes the potential energy surface of your system. So energies and forces as a function of the position of all the nuclei. And you have to represent the atomic environments. And then the machine learning algorithm will take care of regressing the potential energy surface. So it will learn the potential energy surface, the quantum mechanical potential energy surface as a function of the descriptors, which are a condensed way of feeding atomic positions to the machine learning algorithm. So I'm going to skip this because I have another slide later on. So the explicit form of these potentials is very simple. So we have a local atomic energy. I'm calling it epsilon I. And we express this atomic energy as a linear combination of kernel functions. So these kernel functions, which are bounded between 0 and 1, they give you a measure of the similarity between two different atomic environments. Right. So this what this does is it turns essentially a nonlinear problem, which is energy and forces as a function of all the atomic positions, into a linear problem. which is energy and forces as a linear combination of some functions. And then these functions are non-linear in the atomic positions. But once you can cast the problem in this linear form, then you can use linear algebra. And that makes things quite powerful. So the way that the kernel measures similarity is this. You have in your database a bunch of structures, right? And then you want to compare this structure for which you want to make a prediction to all the structures that you have in your database. So, I make a database of structures, and then I want to compare a structure for which I want to make a prediction to all of those structures. And then these kernel functions will give me a measure of similarity as a numerical score between 0 and 1. And then these functions allow me to construct my linear combination, and they give me the prediction for the local atomic energy. The equations are simple as this. There's this constant term here missing. And I also want to highlight that once you have all of these fitting coefficients, then you can also predict the forces quite straightforward. So you can calculate the forces analytically from the gradient of the kernels with respect to the descriptors, in the partial derivatives of the descriptors with respect to the atomic positions. This is it's expensive compared to doing this, so it can be between factor of 2 and maybe an order of magnitude more compared to this, because you need to do this for all the atomic neighbors, whereas this is just a local property of the system. Now, these descriptors, which I have talked about a bit in an abstract way until now, they're very important to construct accurate machine learning potentials. So the reason is that the atomic positions do not preserve the symmetry of the interatomic interactions. So essentially, if you rotate a system by an arbitrary angle, then the energy will not change. So this is a symmetry that is not preserved by the atomic positions, because if you rotate atomic positions by some angle, then the system changes. So what we need to achieve is a representation of a bunch of atoms. So it's not only 1 or 2, but it's an arbitrary number of atoms. We need to achieve a rotationally invariant representation. So what we want to do is we want to be able to compare two atomic environments such that the alignment is optimized. And we want to be able to do this computationally very cheaply. Okay. So the way to do this would be to construct the kernel, for example, as an overlap integral between the atomic densities. These are not the electronic densities, they're the atomic densities, right? This is an overlap integral. And what we're doing here is we're rotating one of the environments, right? This R is a rotation operation. And then we're averaging over all the possible relative orientation of the two environments. And this gives us a rotational invariant measure of how similar environment I and environment J are. Now, the problem with this is that, of course, numerical integration is quite expensive. But we can turn this into a different problem where we express the atomic densities in a basis. So we use radial basis and spherical harmonics, and lots and lots of linear algebra later. You come to the result that the many-body kernel for comparing atomic environment I and J can be given as a product and sum of the expansion coefficients for the atomic densities in this numerical basis. And this is our so-called SOAP descriptor. SOAP stands for smooth overlap of atomic positions. So you need to normalize these vectors because the kernel needs to be bounded between 0 and 1, as I have said already. And then you also need to choose how you represent the atomic densities. So in our case, what we do is we represent each atom within a neighborhood of a central atom through a Gaussian function. This could be also some sort of piecewise polynomial function, as long as it's localized. right? And then the information that we retain is the entire atomic density field. So we don't retain only, for example, distances or angles. We actually retain the information pertaining the entire field. So this is a many-body descriptor. So we have our own implementation of SOAP, which is called SOAP Turbo, and this is now being merged with GAP. So GAP is like the original flavor of these kernel-based machine learning potentials, and so I've merged my own implementation with that. So this is going to be available for everybody using the mainstream GAP code. So the idea for SOAP Turbo is that we separate between the radial and angular channels, and this allows us to construct these descriptors a bit more efficiently. And then we also have a smoother radial basis functions, and this makes things more accurate. We can use compression. So if I go back here, you can see that there are 3 indices here. So what that means in practice is that these descriptors are a bunch of numbers. So for example, the first carbon potential that came up using this flavor of machine learning potentials uses, I think it's 324 dimensional descriptors. And this is expensive, okay, when you have to use these descriptors to regress the potential energy surface. But not all of these numbers are equally important for the representation. So in practice, you can discard some of these numbers. It's some sort of projection. So it's like you do a projection of a 3-dimensional vector onto a plane, and then you end up with a 2-dimensional representation. So here it's the same. We do a dimensionality reduction, and we end up with representation. For this particular case, we can go, for example, down from 324 to 72 dimensions, and this affects the accuracy almost not at all. And there are more sophisticated ways to do this. Then we also have very good multi-species support, which means you can add elements other than carbon. For example, if you want to do functionalizations or a graphene oxide, this kind of stuff. And then this is some sort of more exotic stuff. And then there's this business of hyperparameters that if I got it right from Nigel's email, he was a bit scared about this stuff. So hyperparameters are essentially some parameters that do not come from the fit. So the user has to select these parameters before doing the fit. Some of them have a very big influence on the accuracy of your potential, and some of them have no influence at all. You don't really know beforehand which one. So what can we do with these machine learning potentials? And now I'm done with all the equations, and I'm just going to go on to nice videos and figures. So imagine that you have a certain amount of CPU time, and you want to use that CPU time to do a DFT calculation for a bunch of atoms. So if you can do, or if you can calculate the energy and forces of these many atoms with DFT, then with the same amount of CPU time, you can calculate the energies and forces of these many atoms with GAP. And with our SOAP Turbo descriptors and our new implementation, you can do about 10 times as many. Of course, your accuracy goes down when you go from here to there. But being able to do these many atoms is a very attractive feature, because there are many problems that you cannot, you can simply not look at if you're doing DFT, just because of the limitation in the system size or the time scale available. So I'm going to talk a bit about amorphous carbon now, which was, as I said, the first application that I looked at for these potentials. So this is a figure from Nigel's paper from 2005, where he tried to elucidate the growth mechanism in amorphous carbon. So there was a bit of debate in the community about how tetrahedral amorphous carbon grows. So tetrahedral amorphous carbon is a amorphous carbon whose local environments resemble diamonds. So you have lots of sp3 coordinated carbon in the material, and people didn't really know how it grows. So the leading explanation I guess because John Robertson proposed this as the standard explanation in his review paper, was that once you shoot atoms at a carbon target, then simply because you have more carbons in the same space than you had before, then the coordination has to go up necessarily. And that's what creates the sp3 bonding. And then there were other competing explanations, and the explanation proposed by Nigel, according to his MD simulations with the eddy potential, was pinning, whereby there's a pressure wave surrounding the impacting atom, and this increases the coordination, but not at the site of the impact, but actually away from the site of the impact, because this pressure wave is compacting the atoms and increasing the coordination numbers. So we set out to check with the new potentials whether this was the case or not. So I want you to keep your eye on this red atom here. So the color here tells you how fast the atoms are moving, right? And then this red carbon atom is impinging on this growing amorphous carbon film. So if you keep looking at that, you can see it goes down, it hits other carbons on its downward path of destruction, and it creates a big thermal spike there. So we did lots and lots and lots of these impacts. So we did about 8,000 impacts per film. And that means that we gather lots of statistics. And what we saw from these statistics is that indeed, at the site of impact, actually the coordination decreases. So instead of creating sp3 atoms there, you're destroying sp3 bonding where the atom is impacting, and you indeed create sp3 bonding away from that location. And this was in very good agreement with the explanation given by Nigel. The problem with Nigel's simulations was that the sp3 counts fell a bit short of the experimental results, and that's what people were not believing this, because okay, if the numbers don't match, then the physics don't match. So what we verified here is that even though the numbers were falling short, actually the physics was correctly explained. But now, because our numbers were very close to experiment, I guess we could convince a few skeptics. So we tried that with very fast atoms that grow very dense tetrahedral amorphous carbon, but we also repeated these simulations at lower incident energy. So this is a 1 eV film. And what you can see here is what the film looks like after the atom has already impinged and everything has settled. And we can make these films, these movies of growing films, and you can see how the atoms attain different coordinations based on the colors. So I'm just gonna skip through the whole video. And then from this kind of simulations, we can kind of make an atlas of the structure of amorphous carbon as a function of incident energy. And one of the very nice things from these simulations, and this is actually absent from C-edit simulations, is that so we can get the right ratio of sp2 and sp3 carbon in the bulk of the film, but we can also get this kind of subtle feature of the surface, where the structure of the surface is very strongly dependent on the incident energy of the carbon atom. So you get the smoothest surfaces at around 10 to 20 eV, and then after that, even though the bulk looks very much the same, the surface is much rougher. And again, this was also in quite good agreement with some experimental evidence. And this kind of summarizes the work. So this is about the early work that focused only on the high density forms of amorphous carbon, where the impacting atom just depletes density locally at the site of impact. It creates sp2 carbon right at the surface, and it creates sp3 carbon away from the impact site. And this is essentially the same as Nigel observed 15 years earlier. And now also for the low density films that we started looking at after we were done with the high density stuff. Then we looked at, we observed that sp2 creation for these films occurs just by saturating dangling bonds directly at the surface. So we call this direct attachment. Some things that we're working on at the moment as next stuff is porous carbon. So this is a slice through a 1 million atom structure that we looked at with GAP, and then you can see all these nice pores forming in the structure. So these materials are very interesting, for example, for energy applications, to use as anodes and cathodes in new all carbon battery designs. All right, so the early versions of these GAP potentials, they only capture short range interactions. But for some materials, and in particular for graphitic carbon materials, and also long range van der Waals interactions are important. So the problem with long range interactions is that, you know, the longer range for the interaction, the more atoms you have. And then this gets expensive at some point. So the main challenge for adding van der Waals interactions to GAP potentials was, how do we do it cheaply, right? I mean, we don't want to do crappy DFT with machine learning. We want to do good force fields. So the problem is van der Waals interactions are long ranged, and this messes up with our assumption of locality, right? So if you want to brute force learning van der Waals interactions, this is a very bad idea, because as a function of the cutoff, so how far you're looking from each atom, then the number of atoms within that cutoff sphere increases as the cube of the cutoff, because the volume of the sphere increases as the cube of the cutoff. So then the CPU time also increases accordingly, because it's mostly driven by the number of atomic neighbors that you have. So as a simple example, your typical GAP potential for carbon relies on a 4 Ångström cutoff for atomic interactions. And if you want to brute force learning van der Waals with 15 Ångström cutoff, that means that you're making your potential 50 times more expensive. And I've heard Nigel complain enough about GAP being slow. So imagine GAP being 50 times lower. You know, you just do DFT, you don't do GAP. So, so the idea here, the solution, how to tackle this problem, is to rely on a local many-body parametrization of a long-range force field. So the machine learning happens locally, so we keep things tractable, but then we use a simple force field that is parameterized with these complicated functions. Graphically, this is the idea. So atom I is interacting with atom J, and they're far away because there's a long-range interaction, for example, van der Waals. And then all these parameters that characterize the interaction in terms of traditional force fields, they do not depend, the first approximation, on what happens far away, right? So they only depend on the immediate local environment. So for the particular case of van der Waals, we want to learn the C6 coefficient, and we can do that as a function of what's going on in the local atomic environment. And then we use that to parameterize something else. So this looks a bit like a mess, lots of equations here. But the main point that I want to make for the specific Tkatchenko-Scheffler flavor of van der Waals dispersion corrections is that you have a very simple force field, which is this screen London dispersion force field, that depends on the 6th power, or the inverse 6th power of the interatomic distance. So we keep this simple force field, and now we do all the machine learning for these parameters. And these parameters depend on the local atomic environment. So in practice, what we have to do is we have to learn the so-called Hirschfeld volumes. And once you have the Hirschfeld volume, which is given per atomic environment, then you have solved the entire problem, because this is cheap. So these are some numbers, these so-called learning curves for these models. So what this says essentially is that it's easy to learn these with the same descriptors. There's so many descriptors that we use for the gap. And one thing that we actually put a lot of emphasis on is that we can reuse the same descriptors that we use for the covalent interactions. We can reuse them to compute the Hirschfeld volumes. Because computing these descriptors is actually expensive computationally. So if we had to compute a completely different set of many-body descriptors for the van der Waals, then we would make the model at least twice as expensive. And then this is something for those of you who do DFT, this is something that I like to brag about, which is that our implementation of Hirschfeld model or Hirschfeld volumes is actually more accurate than VASP for forces. And the reason is that if you remember a slide at the beginning of my presentation, we can get the analytical gradient of the local quantities that we learn. And in this case, the Hirschfeld volumes, they depend on an integral of the electron density. And they have, so you have for the forces, you have the gradient of this energy, and then the gradient of r to the -6, that's trivial. But the gradient of this and this is non-trivial. So it's non-variational in the electron density, and essentially VASP cannot do it out of the box. So what that means is that if you compute the forces with our implementation, they're actually better than the forces predicted by our reference method, which is very counterintuitive, especially if you know how machine learning models are fitted. And it's a bit suspicious. So you always have to explain to people the details of why this is the case, because most people think, okay, you cannot learn the reference data better than you know, what the reference method predicts it. Okay, so we have applied these van der Waals corrections to look at C60 systems. And for this, we train a new gap potential for carbon. And this is the way that we represent atomic databases when we train this potential. So this is a so-called two-dimensional embedding, where we represent high-dimensional data. So in this case, the atomic environments, we represent those data on a 2D plane. And the closer 2 points are on this map, then the more similar two atomic structures are to one another. So you can see that we have some diamond structures here. Then all the sp2 structures are here. We have amorphous carbon. Then we have graphitic structures. We have surfaces that have lots of under-coordinated atoms. And we have lots of fullerenes for this particular gap, because of course we want to do C60. Then we need to have these structures in the database. And with this atomic data, we compute the energy and forces, and then we use that to train a new machine learning potentials. And these are some sort of standardized tests that that we run on all of these machine learning potentials. Because, so one thing that I'm extremely annoying about is that, you know, for those who are used to classical force fields and DFT and so on, sometimes it's difficult to wrap your head around the idea that your machine learning model doesn't know anything about physics. It doesn't know anything about chemistry. It doesn't know anything about the Schrodinger equation. It only knows about data. So if you haven't shown the data in the relevant portion of configuration space, you have absolutely no guarantee that your potential will give you a sensible prediction there. So it could be anything. And then we need to do all of these tests, including these kind of exotic phases of carbon. So there was a recent problem with one of the machine learning potentials for carbon, where the BCC curve for carbon was actually lower in some portions than graphite and diamond, which is obviously nonsense, right? But if you don't teach your potential that that PCC is energetically unfavorable, then the potential doesn't know it. And you could get any prediction there. So that curve that is, in our case is safely up there. Then in that particular case, it was showing for very low density, it was showing something like this. Yes, so some standardized tests. Then we also took a look at the graphite exfoliation because we included these van der Waals corrections, and we wanted to make sure that we can actually reproduce the DFT data. Also some amorphous carbon, and then this is our Herschel volume model. Again, pretty good agreement. You want all of these points to be along the diagonal. That means perfect agreement between the reference method and the machine learning predictions. And then energy predictions are very good, force predictions are very good. So we're very happy with this potential. And some of the things that we use this potential for was, as I said, looking at the structure of C60. This is at very low density. So we took a look at how clusters of C60 molecules form at very low temperature. And then we could check, for example, that these clusters are stable up to about 500 Kelvin. And then they break apart. And the structure is predominantly HCP rather than FCC, which is the stable crystal structure at very low temperature. Then at 1000 Kelvin, they're completely doing their own business. There's too much kinetic energy for them to stick together. And then if you keep increasing the temperature, then you just completely break things apart. And you just have this kind of gas. Maybe more interesting is this high pressure, high temperature metastable phase diagram that we computed with our potential. So we start with some C60 seed. And what we do in this case is that we prepare the seed at some pressure and then we increase the temperature. And we look at what kind of transformations take place. So this relies on the molecular dynamics times that are accessible to us, which is about 200 picosecond per point on the graph. So there's a total of about 1 nanosecond worth of dynamics for each pressure value. In practice, of course, thermodynamics would be equivalent to the very long time scale of molecular dynamics in a way. So we cannot really sample the thermodynamic limit for the stability, but we can get a feel for at which conditions things are happening. So we could demarcate here the phase boundary between liquid carbon and the C60 condensate. And then we also get the qualitatively nice island of stability for graphitic carbon, and also the transition from the C60 solid to amorphous diamond. And then if you keep increasing the temperature, then you start to nucleate actual crystalline or polycrystalline diamond. Quantitatively, the lines demarcating the phase boundaries might not be exactly where they appear on this graph, but I think this is a great success of the method because the chemistry and physics involved in this, varying the pressure over 5 or 6 orders of magnitude, all the kind of bond breaking and formation events that are taking place here. This is extremely complex. Of course, you cannot do this with DFT. You cannot even dream of doing this with DFT. There's about 15,000 atoms per structure, and then there's like a nanosecond. That's, it's impossible computationally to spend that much CPU time doing this with quantum mechanics. And for a classical force field that, was essentially the only tool to do this kind of thing maybe 10, 15 years ago, you don't have a potential which is sophisticated enough to deal with all the nasty chemistry and physics that is happening here. So I think this is definitely the way that the field is going to be going for the foreseeable future. And things, so all the limitations for our potentials are going to get kind of sweep out of the way, I think, one at a time. And I think these potentials are only going to get more accurate and cheaper in the next years. So hopefully this panel has convinced the skeptics among you. And okay. So XPS, for those of you, I put this usually for the experimentalists because experimentalists love this kind of X-ray spectroscopy. So XPS stands for X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy. And essentially what you're doing is you're throwing X-ray photons on a sample, and you're exciting the core electron. So in carbon, that would be the 1s electrons, which are deep in the potential well. And then you measure the kinetic energy of the photo-ejected electrons. And because you know what's the incident energy, then you can measure the binding energy of the core electron. And the binding energy is a function of the atomic environment. So this is a way for experimentalists to probe the atomic structure of a sample. And it's very popular for people working on carbon materials and carbon where you also have hydrogen and oxygen. Okay, so I just said all of that. So if we were able to have accurate computational predictions of XPS, then this is a way to validate our atomic models, right? So what we do, people doing computational simulation of materials, is we're coming up with a candidate atomic structure for a material all the time. This is what we do. And there are different ways how you validate that you actually have the right structure. So you can look at mechanical properties, you can look at radial distribution functions, and you can also look at X-ray spectroscopy. The problem with computational X-ray spectroscopy is that it's actually very expensive. So it would be a lot more expensive to do the spectroscopy prediction than it would be to generate the structure. So how do we solve this? So density functional theory based on Kohn-Sham eigenvalues is a very bad approximation for this. You need to rely on things even more expensive than a single shot DFT calculation. So you have to rely for XPS prediction on energy differences. So imagine that you have a structure with 1,000 atoms. You need to do 1,000 DFT calculations to get the XPS spectrum. But this is still not great. And then there are things like going beyond DFT, for example, GW calculations. So GW calculations are about 2 orders of magnitude more expensive than DFT. So this gets completely out of hand. But this is what we've done. Machine learning is an obvious way to get rid of the problems associated with the high CPU costs. So the efficiency of the machine learning model, which I have been focusing a lot on for the first half of my talk, it is important, but for some problems, the main issue is how much it costs you to generate training data. And if we need to generate training data using GW, so GW is a Green's function-based method. It's kind of state-of-the-art for this. Then if we need to rely on GW, we need to absolutely optimize the training data points that we select. We cannot just randomly, generate training data and then use all of that because it's very expensive. So for this project, we have spent about 20 million CPU hours generating GW data, and still we quite optimize that. So generating this data relies on having atomic structures, and then we compute the different core levels for the different atomic environments. And the core electron binding energy has a relationship with the original atomic environment. It's kind of a footprint of the atomic environment. So what we did is we generated GW data initially for these small molecules. So this is very cheap. Because there are very few atoms here. And we generated GW data and we also generated DFT data using this so-called delta Consham model. And you can see how, as we increase the number of samples, and we can improve the accuracy of our model. But very interestingly, the difference between the GW prediction and the DFT prediction converges much faster with the number of samples. So if you look, for example, at just learning with machine learning, the GW prediction, for example, this point there, if we try to trace it back to the accuracy, the same accuracy for the difference, then we can decrease the amount of training data by about 1 order of magnitude. So then the kind of obvious thing to do here is that instead of focusing on learning GW data, we learn GW minus DFT data. We need 1,000 times, or actually, sorry, 10 times less data. And then we can do something like DFT plus this, right? And DFT data is so much cheaper to generate than GW data. So we do this so-called delta learning, where we learn the difference and then use that difference to improve the accuracy of a cheaper prediction. This can also be done for machine learning potentials. So you could, for example, use a hybrid functional, or you could use RPA, dispersion energies, or even coupled cluster energies, and learn the difference between your extremely expensive method and DFT, and then correct your machine learning potential using these energies. Okay, but those curves were for small molecules, for which generating the data is relatively cheap. But we're not interested in molecules because they're too easy. What we're interested in is condensed phase materials. So, for example, this oxygenated amorphous carbon here. Now, the problem here is that the GW implementation that we use cannot handle periodic boundary conditions. So we need to resort to a bunch of tricks, where, for example, we focus on the atom for which we want to compute the core electron binding energy, and then we carve a cluster center there. We make sure that we don't break any bonds. We don't have floating atoms or anything like that, because that would mess up the spins in our system. And we do the calculations for those. And that's a lot more tractable than doing the calculation for the original structure. And of course, if you have a very small environment, then you're nowhere near the truth. But as you increase the radius, you can see that things converge at some point. And then you can say, okay, so I'm safe with this kind of representation of the solid. And these are a bunch of models. I'm not going to explain this. I'm going to show you this. And these are some predictions that we made with these models for this kind of atomic structures, which is oxygen-rich amorphous carbon. You can see that we can make these predictions as a function of the oxygen content. And one nice thing about using these GW-corrected XPS models is that we get the absolute position of the different peaks in very close agreement with experiment. And another nice thing is that we can actually trace back the contribution to each part of the spectrum. We can trace it back to the precise atom from which it originated. So you can see here, this is color-coded from very dark to very light, according to where that particular atom is contributing to the XPS spectrum. And just to show you how powerful this is, so we made this XPS prediction server, which is, it's not public at the moment, but I'm planning to make it public once we submit this paper. It should be ready anytime now, but let's see. I've been saying that for half a year. So what you can do here is you can upload a file. At the moment, it's constrained to carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen containing samples. So I also have a list of examples that you can use to see how this works. For example, this oxygen-rich carbon. I'm going to click there. and then you choose one of the different models that we have trained. And I'm going to make a prediction, for example, here for CHO containing materials. I'm going to make a carbon 1s core prediction based on GW minus DFT plus DFT data. I mean, the details are a bit complicated, so I'm not going to go in detail there. Then I choose a thermal broadening, click there, and you see what it took. So it took like 3-4 seconds to make an XPS prediction for this. And you know, if you have to do this with DFT, or if you have to do this with GW, it will take you millions of CPU hours to do this. And as I said before, we have the individual contributions to the spectrum. So, so you have for each carbon atom, then you have the energy of the core electron for that particular carbon atom. So I very much think that this is the future in computational driven materials characterization, where for sure we cannot get rid of quantum mechanics because we still need to generate training data, but we can make these models reusable by the community. And if you're focused, for example, on just generating the structure, then you can validate your structure coming to one of these services. You upload your XYZ file or your OSCAR or your PVD file, whatever. You get this, and then you talk to your experimental colleague and say, hey, have you measured the XPS for this sample? Can we compare? And then you get an idea of whether you're talking about the same thing or not. I think I'll just show the last slide for this, which is here. So another nice thing about making these predictions is that you can also tell what's missing from your model, right? So here I'm comparing for reduced graphene oxide. I'm comparing a prediction that we've done on somebody else's candidate structures for reduced graphene oxide. And I'm comparing that to experiments from some colleagues here from Finland. And you can see that the spectrum matches very well the experimental one, the predictions, except for this peak here, right? And we can trace this peak back to carboxylic acid type of functional groups attached to the graphene. So what this is telling us is that essentially the computational structure for reduced graphene oxide that the computational guys have generated are correct, but they're missing something. And we can actually tell what precisely it's missing. It's not always, of course, I'm showing you a nice example. It's not always so easy to tell what's missing from the spectrum, but in this case, it's a very nice example of how you can combine computation and an experiment to elucidate the structure of materials. In this case, carbon material, but of course you can extend this to, I don't know, amorphous semiconductors, oxides, you know, as long as there's somebody willing to generate the data and train the models. But methodologically, it's all the same. Okay, so this is the last slide of my presentation, where I would like to thank all the many people working with me. So I'll mention by name Heikki, who was working on the Van der Waals. He's a PhD student in our group. And then Xichen, Albert Bartok, and Gabor Chani. So Albert and Gabor invented, they invented GAP and SOAP. So of course I'm indebted to them. And now we're collaborating a lot on kind of making these things more accurate and faster. And then I'll also mention by name Dorothea, who did all the GW calculations. So please do not ask me about the GW calculations because I don't know anything about them. Dorothea did all of those. And she also implemented very cheap, you know, quotation marks, GW implementation. And then I also mentioned Volker. So I've been collaborating a lot with Volker Deringer on generating these carbon structures, and also I learned. Essentially, he introduced me to gap simulation, and he made the first gap potential for carbon. So he kind of started things a bit, at least on the carbon side. Yeah, so I think that's all from me. And if there are any questions coming my way, then I'll be happy to try to address them.
Okay, that was absolutely fantastic, Miguel. It's so many questions to ask. So we'll just go through the ones.
But not about GW.
Yeah, I don't think there are any GW questions here. I've been monitoring the chat box. So yeah, the first question that we have is how large are the computer resources that you need to simulate 1 million atoms of your porous carbon?
So these million, I mean, 1 million atom simulations, you don't really need that. Maybe you can get away with 100,000, but we were kind of trying to stretch things and see how far we could get. So for 1 million atoms, I did, if I remember correctly, 200 picosecond dynamics with 1 femtosecond time steps, and I spent maybe 500,000 CPU hours on that simulation. It's not something that you do every day, but you know, nowadays we can routinely spend 2-3 million CPU hours on a paper. You know, to give you an idea of the resources, and of course, this kind of simulation allows us to answer questions, because this 1 million atom simulation is not something you just cannot do it with DFT. And classical potentials are just not good enough. So it's kind of, okay, it's expensive, but I think depending on the problem, it's worth it.
Yeah, it's a lot, but it's not obscene. Yeah. Okay. So well, this is obviously a comment that it's very amazing work. Are these models commercial, open access? I'm pretty sure this is talking about the XPS simulation that you showed, where you could upload the...
So the XPS will be completely open. Now, the gap code has an academic license. So meaning if you do academic research, then you're good to go. You can just use the code, you can modify it, you can share it. If you're a greedy company that wants to make money out of our hard work, then you need to buy a license for gap. Yeah, I mean, some people don't like this kind of model. I'm a bit ambivalent about it. The potentials that we fit, they're open source and they're free to use by anybody. Okay. So yeah, yeah. There's a bit of everything, but I think so. I like this model where you know, people who are just willing to do academic research are free to use the codes. They don't have to pay for them. And if your objective is to make money, for example, you're a big pharma company, you know, buying a license is kind of peanuts for you.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah,
I think that's a very fair model. Okay, so this is obviously another comment. So the C60 phase diagram is amazing. What is the structure of ultra dense AD, amorphous diamond? Are the atoms still tetrahedral, or are they something else?
The structure is a mess. Well, it's so you have exotic coordination. So most of the atoms are fourfold bonded, but then you have lots of atoms getting really close to one another. So the density for those structures that I showed there is about twice as large or twice as big as the density of regular diamond. And we looked at the coordinations, and if I remember from the top of my head, it's on the archive preprint. I think about 75% of the atoms are fourfold coordinated, and then you have a non-negligible number of fivefold coordinated atoms and also some sixfold coordinated atoms. Okay. I also have to say, so these potentials are not explicitly trained to do extremely high pressure simulation. So we don't have many structures that would resemble diamond with a density twice as high as regular diamond. We do have very high temperature melt, and the nice thing about using high temperature liquids to train your potential, at least to provide a baseline for your potential, is that transiently, locally, these high temperature melts can resemble lots of outrageous environments. And that means that that you're kind of covered configuration space, very wide portion of configuration space. So just with liquid carbon database, you can make sure that your potential is not going to be absolutely horrible anywhere. You cannot enforce that it will be very accurate everywhere, but you can enforce that it's not going to give you nonsense.
Yeah.
So I think the very dense structures, you have to take them with a pinch of salt, but they should be they should not be outrageous. A classical potential would completely break down for many of these structures.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we have any more questions here. Yeah, so there's a question here about the again the 1 million atom structures. What was the density of that amazing structure you showed, and what temperature were you annealing it at? And have you computed any properties of your porous carbon?
So for this 1 million atom simulation, I've only done, I think, 1.5 grams per cubic centimeters, and the annealing temperature was 3,500 Kelvin, which we took from actually one of your papers. Was it Carla's paper where you're comparing all of these carbon potentials? And
good glassy carbon temperature.
Yeah, I can actually I can share, because we're working at the moment on more comprehensive study on porous carbon. So I'm just going to find this figure. For that 1 million atom structure, we have not computed any properties. But let me see if Overleaf wants to compile this or not. Okay, I'm almost there. Okay, here. So there is a very good student. He's called Yangso, and he's looking at some of these structures. So this is a comparison between the structure predicted for different densities. So these are slices through the material, and here you can see, if I remember correctly, 0.5 grams per cubic centimeter, 0.7, 0.9, and no, that must be different. I think this is 1.7, actually 1.3, something like that. Anyway, it's from very low density to very large density, and you can see how the pore size distribution changes. You have very open, large pores here, and then you have very tight structures here. And we computed bulk moduli. Actually, the densities are here. Okay. So 0.5, 0.9, 1.3, 1.7. We have computed bulk moduli and Young's moduli for these structures as well. But because you're recording this, I'm not going to show the data, because this is work in progress.
We will chop this bit out. It's okay. It's all right.
Yeah. No, I think you can show the structures, but I'm not going to show you the tables, because I have not warned any of my co-authors. I don't think it would be appropriate to do that.
Okay, well, I think we're pretty much at the end of our hour. We've gone ever so slightly over, so apologies to those of you who need to go to sleep. So I'd just like to thank you again, Miguel, for an absolutely fantastic talk. It's we appreciate it so much. It's very obvious that machine learning and artificial intelligence methods are going to take over so many things that we used to do with intuition, and it's definitely come to the world of carbon in a big way. So as the last thing before we move to Gather Town to have a bit of a chat with each other, if you have time, I'd just like to let you know that the next talk in this series will be in just under 2 weeks' time, and it will be given by Professor Mauricio Toronis, and it will be at the same time slot, unless, of course, there's something strange happening with daylight saving in your part of the world. So please check the website to find out what time that is, and look forward to seeing you then. And of course, for anyone who would like to stay around and have a bit of a chat in an informal way, please go to the chat box and click on the link, and that will take you to this piece of software called GatherTown, which we did use a couple of weeks ago, and it was a lot of fun. It was nice to be able to talk one-on-one and in groups. You can wander around a bit like you're in a Super Mario. It's a bit like a cross between Super Mario and Zoom. So I hope to see you online in GatherTown in a couple of minutes. Just click through the links and create your avatar and type your full name so we know who you are, and we can have a bit of an informal chat. But thanks again, Miguel. It was fantastic.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and yeah, look forward to interacting with all of you, maybe on high pressure carbon simulation.